All right, everybody. Welcome to today's Murphy Mini. We'll give folks a little bit of time to trickle in as we usually do. Today we are talking about HSAs. We're saying getting personal about HSAs. You'll hear me talk about this later on because the HSA is owned by the individual. It's a very unique account that we work with, and it's different than a lot of your employer-sponsored group health plans. If you're already like, what is this guy talking about? Don't worry, we'll get into it a little bit more later. I don't know, Claire, what do you think? Give the usual 1 minute.
Yeah, I probably would. We're still seeing a lot of people come in. And I have to say this, Nick, I finally got the getting personal part this morning when I was looking at it. I kept thinking, that's a really great title. I wonder where he got it. And then I was like, oh yeah, personal. They are personal.
Uh-huh. Well, us attorneys aren't known for being creative, and this is these titles are
Yeah.
usually my best attempt at being creative, so bear with me, right? And actually, I might go ahead and get started. I've been informed that a lot of our friends south of the Minnesota border are on spring break right now.
Yep.
And so I think we might have slightly lighter numbers than we usually do. So we'll go ahead and get started. So again, we're talking about HSAs today. I'll try to remember to do our usual spiel at the beginning here to answer your questions. We don't have Lisa up. I got to get Lisa on the title page. Although she had a little dental work done yesterday and she was chewing on her cheek. So she's talking kind of funny. Maybe okay that she's not doing a lot of talking today. I think that would have been a HIPAA violation. I was just giving up your medical information. We are
I can
recording
send to it.
this.
Good. Whew.
We are recording this. We will make the slides available. Send in your Q&A. Claire, let's try. I think, again, we'll be able to get through this relatively quickly and have some time for questions at the end.
I
So
do
we'll
too.
answer the questions at the end, which means we may not send out a Q&A with this. We'll try to answer all the questions live at the end. So that way you can all participate in that. But again, use that Q&A function to send in questions. And we will be providing the materials. Here's our usual disclaimer. Wouldn't be a Holmes Murphy Mini without it. We're not giving legal or tax advice in this presentation. If you need legal or tax advice, we highly recommend you talk to your legal counsel, your tax advisor. But with that, let's dive right in. And we're going to start about what makes an HDHP, a qualified HDHP, so that way individuals can contribute to an HSA, and what do individuals need to do to remain eligible to contribute to that HSA. So a health savings account is a medical spending account that is owned by the individual. Hence the title, Getting Personal About HSAs. They are owned by the person, by the individual. While you will sponsor the high deductible health plan that enables someone to contribute to the HSA, ultimately that HSA is owned by the individual. And so a lot of the rules we're going to talk about today, as far as contribution limits, what they can use their funds for, things like that, that all falls on the employee. We can do lots of education. We want to do lots of education. We want to make sure that we're setting up the health plan correctly so that way people can contribute to the HSA. But ultimately, a lot of the responsibility, according to the government, does fall on the individual. This is going to be very different than a health FSA or an HRA. Health FSAs and HRAs are group health plans. Those are employer-sponsored medical plans that you own, that you control. And if there's non-compliance, if something goes awry, usually that does actually fall on your shoulders. Whereas with the HSA, again, we kind of bring it back to the individual. Of course, an individual must be covered by a qualified high deductible health plan as of the first day of a month without any impermissible other coverage to be eligible to contribute to an HSA for that month. And we'll talk about it, impermissible other coverage, I think, on the next slide. One of the things that we want to try to hammer home, because I feel like we get a lot of questions on this, is what about impermissible other coverage that doesn't actually cover the individual? So what will happen is an employee's spouse will go on Medicare, right? The employee's not on Medicare, but the employee's spouse will go on Medicare. And we'll get the question, well, do they have to reduce their HSA contributions? Can they still contribute to the HSA? And the answer is yes. So long as that individual is not actually covered by that impermissible other coverage, it's fine. Another example is sometimes you'll have an HRA that only covers the employee's medical expenses or only covers premiums for excuse me, an HRA that covers the spouse's medical expenses or will only cover the spouse's insurance premiums, whatever it is, so long as that HRA does not provide any coverage for the individual that wants to contribute to the HSA, they're fine. And now one quick caveat to that is sometimes people say, well, the HRA could, but they're not going to use it that way. Is that okay? The answer is no. If it could cover them, then it's impermissible other coverage. The answer has to be it can't. It can't cover them. Yes, Claire.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, I have not seen a lot of HRAs that are simply limited, to a spouse or to a single person. It used to be very, very common. I haven't seen a lot of them lately. So I wanted to kind of get your sense of where you have seen that.
Those are disappearing. They were far more common about 10 years ago, but with some of the rules that we have with the Affordable Care Act and making sure that HRAs are embedded with a major medical plan, making sure that, if they're not embedded, that we're paying the different, the core fee, reinsurance fee, if it wasn't embedded. Like there were all sorts of things that went with an HRA that I think a lot of employers said, well, why do this? Why don't I just put seed money into an HSA now that that's available and go that route? And kind of makes sense to me, right? I mean, HSAs are relatively new. And so I would say that the HSA has actually taken the place of the HRA. And sorry, one last thing on that. And that makes sense because health FSAs, the funds disappear at the end of the year, whereas HRAs, you could roll it over year after year. And that's the same thing with an HSA, right? HSAs, once that money goes into that account, the individual owns it. It can sit there forever, basically. And so that's why I think the HSA has replaced the HRA. We don't see as many of those HRAs designed anymore where it's employee only, whatever, just because you don't have as many HRAs. Great question, Claire.
Listen, so I know we're trying to wait until the end, but this is good timing. How is an HRA different from an HSA?
Yeah, so the HRA is funded solely with employer dollars. It is an employer-sponsored group health plan. It is funded only with employer dollars. Employees cannot contribute to an HRA. It has to come just from the employer. And then the employer has full control over it. It's an ERISA government plan if you're not a governmental entity. And the employer at any time could say, you know what, we're terminating this plan. You no longer have access to those funds unless they're put into a trust or something like that. And employers have all sorts of discretion to say each year we're going to, you can carry over a certain amount, but you won't go past $4,000, whatever. Whereas the HSA, again, a key difference is the HSA is owned by the individual. And therefore, once the funds go into that HSA, the employer has no control over that HSA. That is a good question. And then finally, the individual cannot be claimed as anyone else's dependent. So if you have those young employees where somehow they're still being claimed as a dependent, which if they're an employee, it's kind of weird, but not impossible. If you have a young employee that can be claimed as dependent by one of their parents or someone else, they are not eligible to contribute to an HSA. That also comes into play later on when we talk about the contribution limits. So let's talk a little bit about that impermissible other coverage and go through some examples. So Medicare coverage, we're talking about when someone's actually covered by Medicare, they're entitled, they're covered by it, will preclude someone from contributing to an HSA. One of the things we generally don't want to do is automatically terminating an employee's participation once they reach age 65. Some employers were kind of using that as a tool because they're running into an issue with a lot of employees not realizing they couldn't have both. We might run into an ADEA issue where you're denying them a benefit that they should be eligible for if they don't have Medicare. So it's probably better to just do a lot of education. Now, Claire, what's one of the most important things we can educate around Medicare and HSAs?
Well, the 6-month look back period is certainly one of them.
That's the biggest one. Yeah.
Yep.
And so with the 6-month look back period, what we're talking about there is sometimes when someone gets Medicare after they've turned 65 or they start taking Social Security distributions after they've turned 65, they will get retroactive coverage up to 6 months back. And so if they've been contributing to an HSA during that time, they may have to do a curative distribution or look at that. So usually we want employees to start or to cease making their HSA contributions ahead of time, knowing that they'll have that 6-month look back. That's another piece that we'll get into at a later date. General purpose health FSAs. where we run into this the most is with grace periods and runouts, not runouts. That should be rollovers. Grace periods and carryovers. Runouts are just fine. We'll correct that when we send out the slides. When we are looking at that, if someone has funds in their FSA and they have a grace period, or if funds are carried over into the new plan year, that will preclude HSA contribution eligibility. With the grace period, it's just for the time period that you have that grace period. For carryovers or rollovers, if there's any funds, then technically that precludes the individual from contributing to the HSA for the entire year, even if it's $5 and the person spends it right away. There are a couple of mechanisms that can be designed. Yeah, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that cannot be, overstated enough here. People will really think, well, I only had 50 cents. Or, maybe I had a run out period and I didn't, I had actually used all the dollars, but I hadn't submitted maybe a paper claim on that until the last minute. And all of those particular things would really prevent somebody for an entire year of contributing to an HSA. And people are so understandably upset when they've gotten a high deductible health plan and then they find out that they're stuck and they cannot, oh, did I say run out? Carry over?
Keep going.
I love this. I have no idea what you're doing, but I love it. So, you're really preventing people to get from getting the full use out of their high deductible health plan if they can't join that HSA. So point being, lots of education critical there to make sure people understand that this is going to have an impact on them and how they handle it.
Exactly. And so we do have, look at this, making the change while we're doing the presentation. Great handwriting. It looks like something that my 5-year-old did. We're going to roll with it.
I'm still impressed. I have no idea how you did it, but I love it.
It's professionalism. There are a couple mechanisms though that you can design in there. So one of them is to have anything that's going into the new plan year rolled over into or carried over into a limited purpose health FSA, which will not preclude HSA contribution eligibility. Another one is to just have the FSA turned off. And I'm seeing this option used more, where if someone elects to contribute to the HSA and they've joined the HDHP, their participation in the FSA is immediate or is terminated as of December 31st, with the exception of being able to get their funds out on the runout, which is okay. Runouts do not impact contribution eligibility because you're only getting reimbursed for expenses that were incurred in the prior plan year.
Yes.
Yeah, but if you're looking at this going, hey, that's something interesting, I'd maybe like to do that. It's worth talking to your Ben admin system, talking to your Holmes Murphy friend, because I found it to be a valuable tool, and it's reduced the number of times that we've had employees say, well, wait, I didn't realize I was carrying over $30. What do you mean I can't contribute to the HSA now? A spouse's general purpose health FSA or HRA that covers the HSA account holder. So that's another big one where it's pretty much education, right? Hey, if your spouse has a health FSA, it'll impact your ability to contribute to the HSA, because that health FSA will almost always be able to cover the individual spouse, or so the spouse, the employee. And then watch out for add-on benefits. This is a big one that we're seeing. A lot of vendors are out there coming up with great ideas to help reduce medical spend, to help make your employees healthier, what have you. And if it's not identified as preventive, if it's actually treatment and it's being covered before the minimum deductible is met, we'll talk about that minimum deductible, that will preclude someone from being able to contribute to their HSA. We had some limited guidance on the we had some limited guidance with telehealth for 2024, but that's another one we're watching to see if we get that for 2025. Right now, you can have telehealth without meeting the deductible, first dollar coverage. That's through the end of 2024. We're hoping we see that in 2025, but we aren't sure.
We probably will, though. It's extremely popular, and while there's a reluctance to extend it long term, I think year over year it's really starting to be something Congress knows is pleasing and is interested in doing.
I like it. We won't spend a lot of time on this because this is some pretty basic stuff. The HDHP must have the minimum deductible for single and family coverages. We listed there for 2024. I do want to point out if the family coverage has an embedded individual deductible, that deductible cannot be less than the minimum deductible for family coverage. So you'd have to embed the individual deductible within the family plan at $3,200. Triple check that during as you're doing your plan designs. It'll be different for 2025, obviously, but look at that minimum family deductible. And if you're embedding, make sure you're embedding at that or above that if you want to, but at a minimum, it has to be the minimum for the family deductible. We have a list of allowable preventive benefits and coverage that can be provided before the minimum deductible is met. While the list is comprehensive, there are certain preventive exams that won't explicitly be identified. The best one I can come up with is for breast cancer screening. It then says, for example, mammograms. And we've had a couple of vendors say, well, if we're doing any kind of screening outside of mammograms, it's not explicitly included in the list and it makes them uncomfortable. Well, I would say, no, it includes breast cancer screening. So any kind of screening should be fine. I can't imagine the IRS ever having an issue with that. And then finally, the high deductible health plan must satisfy the maximum out-of-pocket limit. Another one to just look out for. It happens all the time. It's not a huge deal. We can usually find a way to correct it and just call it a mistake, Scribner's error, whatever you want to call it. But you don't want to go above the maximum out of pocket for HDHP plans. And the reason why this is an issue is because the ACA's out of pocket limit is always higher. It's kind of confusing, but so sometimes when we're designing our plans, we want to offer that high out of pocket HDHP that's really inexpensive to some employees and they want to contribute to their HSA. We need to make sure that we're designing to the HDHP's maximum out of pocket for HSA contribution eligibility and not the ACA's.
Right, because only that HDHP limit is going to make it a qualified high deductible health plan, and that's when you can offer access to the HSA at a pre-tax deduction.
We'll continue to fly here to try to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end.
Yeah, because we're getting some good ones.
Yeah, and I figure that might be the case. So with contributions, they can come from the employee, the employer, and any other individual or organization. Employer contributions to an employee's HSA are generally non-forfeitable. That becomes an issue sometimes when an employer does a lump sum, seed money or whatever into an HSA at the beginning of the year. They'll say, all right, we'll contribute $2,000 at the beginning of the plan year, and then someone leaves 2 days later, right? The employer can ask them nicely to return the money, but once the funds are sent over, generally the employer doesn't have many options for getting that money back. We have the limit set up here for self-only coverage is $4,150, and for any other coverage beyond self-only coverage, it's $8,300. Individuals that are 55 or older at the end of the year can make a catch-up contribution of up to an additional $1,000 per year. While they just have to be 55 by the end of the year, if they weren't covered by the HDHP for the entire year, so let's say someone that's 57 years old joins the HDHP halfway through the year, they only get to contribute $500 because they were only covered by the HDHP for half the year. The amount that an individual can contribute to their HSA depends on the level of coverage that they have in place on the first day of the month, unless the full contribution rule applies, which we will get into in a little bit here.
So one question that I think employers usually have, how often can or should they allow individuals to change their HSA contributions?
That's a great question. I would say monthly. And I believe the rule says that we're supposed to allow monthly.
I would say that too. Now, that said, I know we have a couple of clients at least that say, okay, you can change it twice annually, but they don't allow them to do it more often than that. I know. And we have told them that we do not think this is something that they should do. They have agreed to bear the risk.
Yeah,
But
well,
that ties into the fact that, employee eligibility for an HSA is assessed on a monthly basis. And I think that's
it is.
absolutely critical.
And I think we have guidance that the employer is supposed to allow monthly. And then again, there are so many changes in circumstances that may impact someone's ability to contribute to an HSA that it just makes sense to do it monthly. When we're dealing with employees and spouses, they both want to contribute to an HSA. If one of them has family coverage, then they're both treated as having family coverage, and the family maximum for the contribution limit is split between them, whatever ratio they want. So that's a good example here where Kels and I have self-only coverage on the Holmes Murphy plan. Kels has family coverage through her employer, both HDHPs. Her employer gives her $1,000 as part of their contribution. I then contribute the rest. Holmes Murphy HR reaches out to me and says, "What are you doing? You're going past the self. You're doing way more than the level of coverage you have." And I say, "That's because my spouse has family coverage and I am taking the majority of the contribution limit over here." And Holmes Murphy always answers perfectly. And they say, "Cool, it's on you to monitor that and make sure you're doing it correctly." This year I have to do a curative distribution because I'm not good at math. I over contributed. We'll talk about curative distributions. If both have single coverage, then both can contribute the single coverage contribution limit. One of the interesting quirks of the contribution rule, this goes back to not being claimed as someone else's dependent. Domestic partners and adult dependents that are otherwise eligible to contribute to an HSA. So let's say they're covered on the family HDHP plan through the employee. If they set up their own HSA, they can contribute up to the family maximum, even if the employee is also contributing the family maximum, because they're not a spouse, they're not claimed as anyone else's dependent, and they have family HDHP coverage. It's a really weird loophole. And there are some, it's usually the domestic partners, but sometimes it's also the adult dependent, the 25-year-old that's on their parents' plan that then says to the employer, "Hey, I would like to set up my own HSA and I'd like to do the family maximum." Savvy kids that know what they're doing. I would have never thought to have done that when I was 25, but good for them. And then contributions can be made until the tax filing deadline for the year that the contributions are being made, which is usually April 15th. So people have a little bit of time to get those contributions, and they just need to make sure that they're telling whoever their the account custodian is for the HSA that which year to attribute those contributions to. Contributions made by the employer on a pre-tax basis through a cafeteria plan are subject to the Section 125 non-discrimination rules. So if you're going to do seed money and you're going to do it for different levels for different employees, you need to make sure that it's within the Section 125 non-discrimination rules. Contributions made by an employer on a post-tax basis are subject to the comparable or comparable contribution rules. Please, if you're doing that, let's have a talk. The comparable contribution rules are a beast. Almost no employers do post-tax contributions because of how difficult they are. So that might be something that you'd want to tweak going forward. And let's talk about the full contribution rule. This one's a little confusing, but under the full contribution rule, an HSA eligible individual experiencing a mid-year coverage change will have their new annual contribution limit determined by whichever of two options results in the highest amount. So whatever is best for them. Option one is the maximum amount is determined under the general monthly contribution rule for the taxable year based on the individual's HDHP coverage. So really what we're getting down to is what fraction of the year did you have self-only coverage and what fraction of the year did you have family coverage? You then use those fractions to determine how much an individual is able to contribute. And here we have a breakdown of the math, right? So we had 5/12 of the year with self-only coverage and then 7/12 of the year with family. You add them up and that comes out to a contribution limit of $6,570.82. So that's one option. The other option, and is one that we usually see used by higher wage earners who want to take full advantage of the tax savings, is you look at the coverage that the individual had in place as of the last day or as of December 1st, and then they can contribute the full contribution maximum for that level of coverage for the year, so long as they then remain HSA contribution eligible for the following year for the testing period, right? So if someone's, if we use the previous example, someone that went from individual to family coverage could contribute $8,300 for that year. They just need to make sure that they remain HSA contribution eligible through the entire next year. Yes, Claire.
And I would like to add that you also could see this if someone joined your plan mid-year.
Yes.
Right? The same thing would apply. You could contribute that individual if they're still eligible on December 1st, could put the entire amount they're allowed to into that HSA and then would have to remain in the high deductible health plan for the testing period that next year.
let's put that as an asterisk when we send out the slides, because that's a really good point. We see this when people have a change in coverage, but we also see when people become join the HDHP mid-year and they want to do the full contribution. And sometimes it's for the self-only limit, sometimes it's family. But again, you're putting in the full bucket, you're putting in the full contribution, so long as you are eligible for it on December 1st, and then you remain eligible for the entire next year, the testing period. And some of you might say, well, what happens if the person doesn't? Well, that's on the individual. That goes back to, you don't own the HSA account. It's not your job to monitor that. And so the individual, you can communicate that to them, educate them, say, hey, you have to remain HSA contribution eligible, whichever tier of coverage you want, really. It doesn't have to be the one that you made the full contribution under. You have to remain eligible through the entire next year. If you don't, you have to figure that out with a HSA custodian and do curative distributions. And that kind of gets into correcting mistaken contributions. Usually not a big deal to do a curative distribution, to take money out of the HSA and it's taxed as regular income, so long as it's done by April 15th for the year in which the tax year in which the contribution was made. So for me, I over contributed in 2023 by like $150. Again, not great at math. And so before April 15th, and I'm coming up on this deadline, I still haven't done it. I need to contact our HSA custodian and say, I need to do a curative distribution. This is going to be taxable income to me. I'll get some tax forms, whatever. Not a huge deal though. If I don't do that, then it's a 6% excise tax on the net income of the HSA contributions, which isn't a huge penalty, but you generally want to avoid it, and it makes for more fun when you're filing your taxes. This gets more complex when it involves employer contributions. Generally, again, as we said earlier on, employer contributions to HSA are non-forfeitable. The employer can't get them back. There are some limited circumstances where the IRS says, yeah, you might be able to. The HSA custodian might be able to give you that money back without you having to go to the employee and asking them nicely. One is if an individual is never eligible for HSA contributions. So they should have never been able to set up an HSA account in the first place. Then the employer should be able to go to the custodian and ask for that money back. Now, sometimes that's a kind of an analysis that the custodian will find is too subjective. And they'll say, no, we're not giving that money back. And then you're asking the employee. The employer mistakenly contributes more than the annual maximum, or there's clear and convincing evidence of an administrative or processing error. What we see with that one is usually going to be they send in the monthly contribution to the employee's HSA, and then an hour later or a day later, they send a second contribution. And it's clearly outside of the normal schedule of contributions. Someone accidentally processed it early, whatever it is. HSA custodians are pretty good in those situations of returning that money without the employer having to go through the employee to get the money back. And then finally, distributions and W-2 reporting. Distributions from an HSA can be made on a tax qualified, so non-tax basis, so long as it's for a permissible 213D medical expense. For the individual, their spouse, and their dependents. When we talk about dependents here, and I need to put this in, we're talking about tax dependents. It's another key difference between the FSA and the HRA. The FSA and the HRA versus the HSA. FSAs and HRAs, you can do it for dependents up to age 26, so those adult dependents. For the HSA, it has to be tax dependents. We do have it in there. And then distributions can also be made from an HSA without penalties once an individual reaches age 65 with regular income tax applying. However, if distributions are taken before age 65 and they're not for a qualified medical expense, there is a 20% excise tax on it. It's not that someone's actually done anything wrong. If they want to take that money out for a non-medical expense, they're just going to pay a pretty hefty tax on it. And then finally, we have the W-2 reporting obligations. Employers must report most contributions made to an employee's HSA on box 12, form W-2 using code W. The only contributions that you would see on there are the post-tax contributions to the HSA made by the employee, which makes sense because that's not coming from the employer. It wouldn't be on the W-2. And this is one of the mechanisms that the IRS uses to make sure the contribution limits aren't exceeded. So both Kelsey and I, my spouse, we have on our W-2s our contribution limits. And that's the thing I looked at and went, I should have spent more time in Miss Gossett's math class listening and paying attention. Maybe this wouldn't have happened. Not a biggie.
Maybe then we would have gone to medical school.
All right. That's the end of the prepared stuff. Let's try to get through some of these questions. I know we only have a minute, but I think we'll go a little bit over. People have been pretty good about sticking around as we go through that. Let's see here. So Claire, what do we got? Which ones do we want to jump into first?
We have some clarity around Medicare. Our company covers medical premiums for employee and dependents. So if a spouse goes on Medicare, can the employee still contribute to an HSA?
Yes. If the employee is not covered by Medicare, and it's just a spouse, the employee can absolutely contribute to their HSA. They can contribute the full family max. Another good one here. Can somebody use their HSA to pay for medical expenses for someone who is not covered under the HDHP? Yes, so long as either a tax dependent or something that could be claimed as a tax dependent, or it's a spouse, you can use your HSA funds for them. The example here, a child who's on the dad's plan and the dad's plan is a non-HDHP plan. Yes, you could absolutely use the HSA funds for your tax dependent, even if that tax dependent is covered under your spouse's medical plan and it's not an HDHP. After the individual reaches age 65, the HSA funds can be used for, if it's for medical, if it's for a 213D medical expense, it can be used tax-free, or they can use it for whatever they want and just pay regular income taxes on it. So there's no penalty. You just pay taxes if you're using it for non-medical expenses.
So if they have a new employee enrolling in the high deductible health plan and HSA, does the employer need to make sure they do not have an FSA with a former employer within the current year before enrolling them in our HDHP slash HSA?
So you're gonna have to answer that one. The facts lost me and I'm not reading along.
Okay. So no, you don't have to make sure that they had an HSA with a former employer, because once their employment has terminated, they will no longer have access to any of those FSA dollars.
Perfect. Yeah, if their participation in the FSA is terminated,
right,
that's
right.
the end of the story.
That's it. I thought this was a good one. Are young employees ineligible for an HSA if they are a tax dependent, or only if they're a healthcare dependent?
Only if they're a tax dependent.
Right.
If they are a tax dependent of someone else, then they are ineligible to contribute to an HSA. So here, if an employee has an HSA and their spouse has a high deductible health plan through their own employer, is the spouse eligible on the employee's HSA? You could use the HSA funds for that spouse. The spouse could open up their own HSA if they wanted to. Generally, though, the spouse wouldn't be able to contribute to the employee's HSA on a pre-tax basis. If they wanted to contribute to that employee's HSA, they would have to do it on a post-tax basis, because a spouse can't participate in your cafeteria plan. That's so if they wanted the tax advantage of the actual contribution to it and they didn't want to have to take a deduction when they're filing their taxes, it's probably better that they establish their own HSA and make pre-tax contributions that way. I feel like that one's going to fuel some questions. I don't know that I said that or answered that one super smoothly. Let's see here. We've answered a few of these. Yep, an individual can contribute to an FSA if they have Medicare. So FSA contribution eligibility is not impacted by other coverage. It's not impacted by Medicare or anything like that. And interestingly, if someone has the ability to participate in an FSA with another employer, they can max out their FSA contributions at each employer, because it's the limit is based on an employer by employer basis. Do you have any other good ones, Claire, you want to jump on before we call it?
I think that's okay. I think that yeah, I think that we should go ahead and call it. And if people have specific questions, they can reach out to their Holmes Murphy Experience team and we can get them some answers.
Oh, yeah. And sorry, one last thing.
You saw a good one? I
saw a good one. It has to do with catch-up contributions, where an individual was eligible for their own catch-up contribution because they had reached age 55, but their spouse was not eligible for the catch-up contribution. They opened up their own HSA just to make their catch-up contribution because they couldn't utilize their spouses
Mhm.
to do so. That's a great example and a great point to make. All right, I think we're going to call. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As Claire said, doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. Reach out to your Holmes Murphy representative. They know how to get in touch with us. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but just get in touch with them. They'll get us on the horn. They'll shoot us an email, and we'll get you the information you need. Otherwise, we will see you for the next mini. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.